In 2015, a quiet liquidation began in Fort Worth, Texas. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy, and the American Mall electronics store was systematically dismantled. Over 4,000 physical storefronts closed their doors. The annual catalog, a thick book that had once served as a mail-order stereo showroom for millions of American teenagers, stopped printing forever. The consequence was massive. Millions of surviving realistic speakers, from heavy Mach 1s in suburban garages to die-cast Minimus 7s on dorm room shelves, suddenly lost the retail ecosystem that had created them. A decade earlier, the name Realistic had meant democratic access to high fidelity. It had put more component audio into American bedrooms than almost any luxury audiophile brand. The paradox is that Realistic did not disappear because the speakers failed or because America stopped listening. It disappeared because the physical room where America bought its sound had vanished. But the real story of Realistic is not just the death of a mall store. It is the story of American distribution, hidden overseas engineering, and what happens when the retail convenience that builds an audio empire finally turns against it. Every week we tell the stories of the American speakers, stereo stores, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, and what happened when the retail market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Boston, Massachusetts, in 1921. The story begins in Boston, Massachusetts, in 1921. Two brothers, Theodore and Milton Deutschman, opened a small retail store to supply parts to amateur ham radio operators. They named it RadioShack, a reference to the small wooden structures that housed radio equipment on ships. For decades, it was a modest regional business. By 1963, the company was nearly bankrupt, reduced to 9 struggling stores and a pile of uncollected debt. Then came Charles Tandy. Tandy was a businessman from Fort Worth, Texas, who had made a fortune selling leathercraft kits through the mail. He did not know how to design a crossover network. He did not know how to measure frequency response, but he understood American distribution. In 1963, Tandy Corporation purchased the failing RadioShack chain for roughly $300,000. He dropped the space in the name, moved the headquarters to Fort Worth, and began a retail expansion that would change how the country listened to music. To understand why RadioShack's audio division became a behemoth, you have to look at the American living room in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This was the golden age of component hi-fi. Hi-fi, short for high fidelity, was the pursuit of sound reproduction that stayed entirely faithful to the original studio recording. For the first time, Americans were abandoning massive, all-in-one wooden stereo consoles and buying separate pieces of equipment, a turntable, a receiver, and 2 separate speaker cabinets. But there was a problem. The American audio market was highly segregated by class, income, and geography. If you wanted serious sound, you had to visit a dedicated stereo store or a high-end audio boutique. These were intimidating places. They featured thick carpets, quiet listening rooms, and salesmen who judged your wallet the moment you walked through the door. A pair of premium American acoustic suspension speakers could easily cost $300 or $400, the equivalent of several weeks' wages for a middle-class worker, a teenager cutting lawns for summer cash, or a factory worker wanting to hear a rock record with real bass could not afford to walk into a high-end hi-fi shop. Even if they could, the environment was not built for them. The American middle class was locked out of the listening room. Charles Tandy saw the gap. He realized that if he could put affordable stereo equipment in every local neighborhood and suburban strip mall, the volume of sales would be astronomical. But he also knew he could not sell premium audio if he had to charge premium prices. His solution was the house brand. He created the name Realistic. It was a brand owned entirely by RadioShack, placed on everything from stereo receivers to headphones, and most importantly, loudspeakers. This is where the grand paradox of the realistic speaker empire begins. Unlike Paul W. Klipsch, who was stubbornly hammering out wooden horns in Hope, Arkansas, or the acoustic engineers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who were winding their own voice coils, Tandy did not build a massive domestic speaker factory. He recognized that American labor and domestic manufacturing costs were already rising. If he built the speakers in Texas, they would cost just as much as the audiophile brands he was trying to undercut. Instead, Tandy built an American distribution empire that was secretly powered by imported Japanese engineering. RadioShack contracted with massive overseas audio manufacturers, most notably Japanese giants like Foster Electric, Fostex, Pioneer, and Hitachi. These companies possessed world-class acoustic engineering departments and highly efficient manufacturing lines. RadioShack's executives in Fort Worth would dictate the physical design, the target price, and the required specifications. The Japanese factories would engineer the drivers, wind the voice coils, assemble the crossovers, and build the cabinets. When the product arrived on American shores, it wore a badge that said "Realistic." It was a brilliant retail illusion. The customer felt they were buying a trustworthy, domestic-sounding brand from a local Texas-based company. But the sound moving the air in their living room was often the result of rigorous Japanese acoustic science. This strategy allowed RadioShack to offer heavy magnet structures, rigid speaker cones, and real walnut veneers at a fraction of the cost of traditional American hi-fi brands. But a cheap speaker is useless if nobody knows it exists. RadioShack needed a way to bypass the snobbery of the traditional audio magazine reviewers and reach the buyer directly. They did it with paper. The RadioShack catalog was deployed as a weapon of mass distribution, mailed directly to millions of homes and given away free in every store. The annual catalog was a 500-page wish list. It became the most widely circulated consumer electronics publication in America. For a teenager in the mid-1970s, the audio section of the catalog was a portal. The pages featured full-color photographs of massive realistic receivers glowing with green dials, flanked by towering realistic loudspeakers, with the grills removed to expose the raw woofers and horns. The prices were printed in bold black ink. There was no haggling. There was no intimidating salesman. The catalog allowed the buyer to dream, to calculate, and to plan their stereo system in the privacy of their own bedroom. Once the catalog created the demand, the physical stores closed the trap. By the late 1970s, RadioShack was opening hundreds of stores a year. They were placed in small-town plazas, suburban strip malls, and the rapidly multiplying indoor shopping malls across America. You could not go to buy groceries or shop for clothes without walking past a RadioShack. Inside the store, the strategy was simple. Customers would come in to claim a free flashlight through the famous Battery Club promotion or to buy a single connecting cable. While they waited at the register, they were trapped in a room with the sound room display. The walls were lined with realistic speakers wired to a switchboard. A local store manager, often a high school or college kid who loved music, would flip a switch and the room would fill with sound. The listener did not have to drive to the city. They did not have to dress up. They could walk in off the street wearing jeans and hear a stereo image forming between two wooden boxes. The catalog created the desire. But to win the American living room, the company needed a speaker that looked and sounded like it belonged in a high-end audio store. To convince the American listener that a mall store could compete with a dedicated high-end audio boutique, Realistic needed more than a colorful catalog page. They needed physical evidence. They needed a speaker that demanded respect the moment a customer walked past the battery displays and saw it sitting in the listening room. In the mid-1970s, RadioShack unleashed two distinct acoustic arguments that would permanently alter the American home audio market: the heavyweight Mach 1 and the miniature Minimus 7. The realistic Mach 1, introduced in 1976, was not a subtle piece of engineering. It was a massive, heavy, imposing wooden box designed to win the volume wars of the era. It featured a 15-inch woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums. A woofer of this size did not just play bass, it physically moved the air in a suburban basement, hitting the listener in the chest. Above that massive cone, the Mach 1 utilized a multi-cell mid-range horn and a bullet tweeter. A small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail. Instead of using traditional cone drivers for the higher frequencies, it used horns. Horn speaker, a speaker that uses a flared passage to make a driver more efficient and project sound into a room. By using these acoustic amplifiers, the Mach 1 could play astonishingly loud with very little amplifier power. The frequencies inside the cabinet were managed by a heavy electrical network. Crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. Clad in genuine walnut veneer, weighing over 60 pounds, and featuring heavy lattice grills. The Mach 1 looked like it belonged in a professional recording studio. The paradox was immediate. A customer expecting cheap, plastic, supermarket-grade electronics would walk into a local Radio Shack and find a speaker built like a tank, capable of shaking the store's dropped ceiling. 2 years later, in 1978, Realistic introduced the opposite extreme, the Minimus 7. It was a micro monitor, barely 7 inches tall, but when a customer picked it up, they were shocked by the weight. It was not housed in thin wood or cheap plastic. It used a solid die-cast aluminum cabinet. The wooden, plastic, or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air. The rigid, heavy metal prevented the small box from vibrating or adding unwanted distortion. This allowed the tiny woofer and soft dome tweeter to create a precise, highly focused soundstage, stereo image. The illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers. Both the Mach 1 and the Minimus 7 shared the same hidden advantage. The American hi-fi industry dismissed Realistic as a mere house brand, but the executives in Fort Worth, Texas, were secretly leveraging world-class acoustic manufacturing. The massive drivers inside the Mach 1 and the precision aluminum casings of the Minimus 7 were largely built by Foster Electric, Fostex, and Pioneer. Realistic was taking top-tier Japanese hi-fi components, giving them an American identity, and putting them on shelves in every zip code in the country. This overseas manufacturing pipeline, combined with Radio Shack's direct retail model, created an untouchable American price context. In 1976, a pair of Realistic Mach 1s cost roughly $400. That was a serious investment, but a comparable large-format monitor from a prestige brand like JBL or Altec Lansing could easily cost hundreds more. The Minimus 7 was an even greater disruption. It launched at just under $40 per speaker. In 1978, the American minimum wage was $2.65 an hour. A high school student working a part-time summer job could buy a pair of Minimus 7s with less than 2 weeks' pay. To buy a metal-cased micro monitor from a traditional audiophile brand would have cost 3 times as much, and it would have required an intimidating trip to a high-end stereo boutique. At Radio Shack, the teenager just pointed to the shelf and paid the cashier. This was the American distribution breakthrough. The moat that protected Realistic was not a patented acoustic secret. The moat was zero-friction retail. There were no independent distributors taking a cut. There were no independent hi-fi dealers marking up the price to cover the cost of their luxurious listening rooms. The speakers went directly from the assembly line in Japan to a Tandy Corporation warehouse in Texas, and then straight to a mall store in Ohio, a standalone shop in Florida, or a strip mall in California. Because the price was so low and the distribution was so wide, the traditional gatekeepers of American audio had to pay attention. Serious audio publications like Stereo Review and High Fidelity magazine eventually tested and acknowledged the impressive performance of realistic speakers, but the real endorsement came from the listening communities that adopted them. College dormitories at massive state schools like Penn State and Ohio State became saturated with the Minimus 7, perfect for cramped desks and cinder block walls. Mobile DJs and small-town roller rinks bought pairs of Mac 1s because they were virtually indestructible and played loud enough to fill a hall. Suburban basement party rooms relied on Realistic to blast rock records on the weekends. And the budget-conscious vintage audiophile community began to quietly respect the brand, knowing that behind the RadioShack logo sat uncompromised engineering. The strategy had worked perfectly. Realistic had bypassed the snobbery of the traditional hi-fi market by bringing the sound directly to the American consumer. The badge on the grill still said Realistic. But inside the room, the sound moved air exactly like the heavyweights it was built to challenge. The badge on the grill was not decoration. It was a promise about sound. By the early 1980s, Realistic had achieved something that few audio brands, American or otherwise, could ever claim: total market saturation. If you lived in America, you were never more than a few miles away from a Realistic speaker. RadioShack had transformed from a regional electronics hobbyist chain into a national behemoth with over 7,000 stores. They were in the corner of the small-town strip mall. They were in the anchor location of the suburban indoor shopping mall. And they were in the downtown districts of every major city. This was the peak of the mall audio era. For the American consumer, the local RadioShack was not just a store. It was a community institution. It was where you bought the cables for your first tape deck, where you went to look at the new computers, and where, most importantly, you went to be surrounded by sound. In these thousands of locations, the listening room became a standardized American experience. No matter if you were in Fort Worth, Texas, or Portland, Maine, you could walk into a RadioShack and find the same wall of Realistic speakers. It was a masterclass in sensory marketing. The store managers, often young men and women who were genuinely passionate about music, would set up the sound room switchboard to favor the Realistic speakers they knew would sell. They would put on a record, perhaps a clean, well-recorded jazz track or a high-energy rock album, and let the speakers do the work. For the middle-class American family, this was a revelation. Before this, buying a stereo was a high-stakes, intimidating ordeal. At RadioShack, it was casual. A parent could bring their teenager in, they could point at the Mach 1 speakers, and they could walk out with a system that made the house feel like a concert hall. The scale of this operation was immense. We are not talking about a boutique brand selling a few hundred units a year to enthusiasts. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of speaker pairs moving through a logistics chain that connected Japanese manufacturing plants directly to suburban shopping centers. RadioShack's power lay in its volume. Because they were buying drivers and cabinets by the container load, they could afford to put real walnut veneers and massive magnets into products that were priced for the common buyer. And it wasn't just in the home. The Realistic footprint expanded into the American third spaces. Because these speakers were efficient, rugged, and cheap, they became the backbone of local business audio. They were hanging from the ceilings of neighborhood diners. They were powering the background music in local clothing stores. And they were the monitors in the back rooms of small radio stations. Yet, there was a persistent friction. Even as Realistic became the most visible audio brand in the country, it remained the outsider in the eyes of the formal, high-end audio community. The audiophile magazines, which were the gatekeepers of taste in the 1980s, would often give Realistic equipment begrudgingly positive reviews, acknowledging that the performance was shockingly good for the price. But they rarely treated it with the same reverence they reserved for companies that built their own cabinets in the hills of New England or the labs of California. This created a unique psychological status for the realistic owner. You were part of a massive silent majority. You were the person who knew something the experts were missing. You knew that you had spent $300 on a pair of Mach 1s that delivered the same visceral, floor-shaking bass as speakers that cost twice as much. You were the person who had hacked the system. RadioShack had built an empire on making audio democratic, but the retail logic that built the empire was about to turn against the speakers. But as Realistic entered the mid-1980s, the democratic audio strategy began to face its first real structural challenges. The American retail landscape was shifting beneath RadioShack's feet. The company had spent 2 decades perfecting a mall-based retail model that relied on foot traffic, free battery tokens, and the sound room demonstration. It was a model built for a time when the local mall was the center of American social life. But the market was beginning to value price transparency and inventory depth over local convenience. This was the era where the big box retail giants began to rise. Chains like Circuit City and Best Buy started appearing in larger regional shopping centers. These stores were massive, sometimes 10 times the size of a standard RadioShack. They carried dozens of brands at once. A consumer could walk down an aisle and see a wall of receivers from Pioneer, Technics, Sony, and Harman Kardon all sitting side by side. Crucially, these big box stores were using hi-fi as a loss leader. They would slash the prices on popular stereo components to get people in the door, making up the profit on appliances or televisions. RadioShack, with its high overhead of thousands of small, expensive mall leases, struggled to match the predatory pricing of these giants. Simultaneously, the hidden engine of Realistic, the Japanese manufacturing pipeline, was becoming more expensive. As the Japanese yen strengthened against the American dollar in the mid-1980s, the cost of importing those high-quality drivers and cabinets began to climb. The democratic price that Tandy had promised the American buyer was under siege from both the manufacturing side and the retail side. Yet, at the peak of this era, the Realistic badge still meant something vital to the American buyer. It was the everyman brand. In 1984, you could buy a pair of Realistic speakers and know exactly what you were getting. A no-nonsense, honest design that was engineered to survive the abuse of a typical American life. They were the speakers that moved from the living room to the basement, and from the basement to the garage, and finally to the porch or the workshop. The cultural moment was crystallized in the image of the suburban basement party. In homes across the Midwest and the Rust Belt, the Realistic Mach 1 was not just an audio product. It was the heartbeat of the room. When a teenager turned that volume knob, the house didn't just play music, it vibrated. It was a visceral, tactile connection to the music that was becoming harder to find in the increasingly refined, polished world of high-end boutique audio. By the late 1980s, Realistic had reached its plateau. They were selling millions of units, maintaining a presence in virtually every American zip code, and holding a cultural position that brands like Klipsch or Bose could only dream of. But behind the scenes, the management at Tandy Corporation was seeing the writing on the wall. The era of the component hi-fi system, the receiver, the turntable, the 2 speakers, was being challenged by a new kind of convenience audio. The living room was starting to turn away from the stereo rack and toward the television. The age of the home theater was dawning, and RadioShack's retail footprint, once their greatest asset, was about to become their most expensive liability. The empire of mall audio was vast, but the cracks were already starting to show. The first sign that the Realistic empire was in trouble was not a dramatic corporate collapse, but a subtle shift in the shopping experience. In the late 1980s, if you walked into your local RadioShack, you might notice the sound room display had been pushed slightly further toward the back of the store. Near the front entrance, new signs were appearing: cellular phones, computers, and electronic parts. The retail space that was once the temple of the stereo component was being reclaimed by higher-margin, faster-moving technology. This was the small crack in the empire. For a store manager, the math was simple. A pair of realistic Mach 1 speakers took up significant floor space and required a time-consuming demonstration to sell. A cellular phone or a computer peripheral took up inches of counter space and could be sold in minutes. The shift was not driven by a lack of demand for good sound. It was driven by the crushing overhead of the mall-based retail model. RadioShack was paying premium rent for thousands of tiny storefronts across America, and they needed to maximize the revenue per square foot. The physical catalog, once the primary engine of Realistic's success, also began to wither. In the early 90s, the pages dedicated to component hi-fi started to shrink. The lush, full-page spreads of silver-faced receivers and imposing speaker cabinets were slowly replaced by pages of cordless phones, calculators, and proprietary computer software. For the American teenager, the catalog was no longer a portal to a dream stereo system. It was becoming a collection of utilitarian gadgets. The competitive pressure from the big-box retail giants was also reaching a boiling point. Stores like Best Buy and Circuit City were now the standard for the American consumer. They were massive, fluorescent-lit warehouses that turned buying audio into a commodity hunt. Because they sold so many brands at once, they could offer prices that RadioShack, with its thousands of small, expensive leases, simply could not match. The Realistic brand began to suffer from a lack of focus. In an attempt to rebrand and modernize, Tandy Corporation decided to phase out the Realistic name on their higher-end audio products. They introduced Optimus, a name intended to sound more contemporary and competitive. But for the loyal RadioShack customer, the change felt like a dilution. Realistic had been the name they trusted for 20 years. Optimus felt like just another generic label. Even worse, the manufacturing quality began to drift. As the cost of Japanese labor continued to rise, RadioShack moved production to other regions, including South Korea and eventually mainland China. While these new factories could still produce decent sound, the secret sauce, the rigorous oversight by legendary Japanese acoustic firms, began to wane. The heavy walnut cabinets were increasingly swapped for wood grain vinyl over particle board. The magnet structures became smaller. The crossovers were simplified. The brand that had built its reputation on being the everyman's hi-fi was slowly becoming a disposable brand. But the most damaging force was the fundamental shift in how Americans listened to music. The stereo rack, once the pride of the American living room, was being pushed aside by the rise of the television, the home theater boom. The transition from two-channel music listening to multi-channel movie sound was taking over. RadioShack tried to pivot, selling home theater-in-a-box systems, but these were plastic, lightweight, and lacked the soul of the component audio gear that had defined the Realistic legacy. The mall went quiet. The stereo shelves were being cleared for cell phones, and the American audio brand that had lived everywhere suddenly had nowhere to stand. As the 1990s wore on, the small crack in the RadioShack business model became a canyon. The retail shift was absolute. When a customer wanted a new stereo, they no longer walked down the street to a mall store. They drove to a suburban warehouse to compare specs in a Best Buy. Or eventually, they opened a web browser to compare prices on Amazon. RadioShack's massive network of thousands of small, expensive mall leases, which had once been the company's greatest competitive advantage, became a structural anchor, dragging the entire brand toward bankruptcy. The final American chapter for Realistic was not marked by a single factory closing, but by a slow, agonizing erasure. The name Realistic was retired. The products were rebranded as Optimus. Then, in a final attempt to leverage a name that still held some weight in the American consciousness, the brand was folded into RCA. The original engineers who had worked with Japanese manufacturers to voice those speakers were long gone. The cabinet shops that understood how to veneer real wood had been replaced by assembly lines that optimized for plastic and particle board. The most painful consequence was the loss of the service culture. For decades, if you bought a realistic speaker and a foam surround degraded, or a capacitor failed, you could walk into a Radio Shack and a manager would either help you find the part or guide you to a local repair technician. That repair culture died when the stores stopped stocking components and started selling cell phones. The repairability of the Realistic line, the reason it lasted for decades in American garages, was replaced by a replacement culture. When it broke, you didn't fix it. You threw it away and bought something cheap, plastic, and disposable. By the 2000s, the sound room was a ghost. The switchboards were gone. The stores were filled with rows of mobile phone cases and prepaid SIM cards. The speakers that remained on the shelves were no longer hi-fi components. They were small, flimsy, plastic cylinders meant to be plugged into a computer or a television, not to anchor a home stereo system. The badge was still there, but the promise of high fidelity had been hollowed out. The mall went quiet. The catalog stopped printing. The stereo shelves were cleared for cell phones, and the American audio brand that lived everywhere suddenly had nowhere to stand. The story of Realistic did not end with a final bankruptcy filing in 2015. In a sense, it simply moved out of the malls and into the basements, garages, and online marketplaces of America. Today, the mall audio empire is gone. The storefronts that once anchored suburban shopping centers have been replaced by cell phone kiosks, discount apparel stores, or empty glass facades. But if you look closely at the secondary market, at the sprawling digital bazaars of eBay, Facebook Marketplace, and the specialized corners of vintage audio forums, you will find that Realistic is more alive than it was 30 years ago. There is a thriving preservation culture dedicated to keeping these speakers breathing. You will find retired engineers and hobbyists who have built entire YouTube channels around the art of refoaming the woofers of the Mach 1 series. Meticulously peeling away the rotted foam and replacing it with new material so the driver can move air with its original authority. You will find audiophiles who have recapped the crossovers of the Minimus 7, replacing the aging capacitors with modern components to restore the crisp, precise stereo image that once made the speaker a dorm room legend. Why does the original still matter? It matters because of a promise that the modern, disposable audio world has largely forgotten: the promise of modular, repairable performance. A modern Bluetooth speaker is a sealed plastic unit. When the battery fails or the internal electronics glitch, the entire object is destined for a landfill. But a pair of Realistic speakers? They were designed to be taken apart. They were built with heavy magnets and rigid cones that, with a little care and a few hours of work, can be brought back to life to perform exactly as they did in 1978. If you travel to the old Tandy Corporation headquarters in Fort Worth, or walk through the suburban malls where these stores once lived, you won't see any monuments to the Realistic empire. You will see office parks, apartments, or sprawling concrete lots where the indoor malls have been torn down. The geography of the American listening room has been erased. Yet there is a surprise footnote. Many of the original Japanese manufacturing partners, the firms that secretly built the Realistic drivers and crossovers, went on to become the giants of the professional audio world. The engineering discipline that Tandy demanded for a $30 speaker helped forge the very standards that now define modern high-end audio. The story of Realistic reveals something profound about how America builds, hears, and discards sound. We say we value fidelity, craftsmanship, and repairability. But the market has consistently rewarded convenience, miniaturization, and the infinite disposable novelty of the streaming era. Realistic was the last great bridge between those two worlds. A brand that brought serious, component-based audio to the masses before the masses decided they preferred the simplicity of a single wireless box. The badge is faded. The malls are empty. The catalog is a collector's relic. But somewhere in an American basement, a pair of old walnut speakers still stands beside a silver receiver, the grill cloth dusty, the wood grain showing its age, waiting for a record, a receiver, and one more song. See you in the next one.